Welcome to the Nebraska Soybean Board Weekly Market Roundup, being brought to you by Nebraska soybean farmers and their checkoff. I'm Susan Littlefield, and we're going to talk a lot of factors that are weighing into our market trade today. Like it or not, politics is a part of it. We'll talk about China, what's going on with their stimulus. We'll also look at what's going on with those export numbers. Boy, the last couple of days, we've definitely seen that appetite building for our U.S. products. We'll talk about that and a whole lot more as we continue right after this.
Meet the champions of innovation in the heart of Nebraska. They're not just farmers, and they nurture more than just crops, pushing boundaries and turning challenges into opportunities. They trade knowledge and know-how, and their dedication doesn't end at harvest. It's in your every bite and every drive. The future of food, fuel, and fiber, and the future of Nebraska starts right here.
Welcome back once again. As you can see, joining me today is Shawn Hackett with Hackett Financial Advisors and Jeff Peterson, Jeff with Heartland Farm Partners. And gentlemen, it's been a very interesting week when it comes to export opportunities of our products. And Jeff, I want to start that with you. Kind of give me your thoughts as to what you're seeing with these export numbers that just continue to grow over the last couple of days.
It's been great to see. We've had flash sales, I think around somewhere around about 9 days in a row, and this export sales we saw this past week were really good. On the corn side, over 4.16 million metric tons, which rounds off to almost 165 million bushels that they'll bought between the 2024 crop and the 25 crop on the corn side. And then over on the bean side, you ended up having over 2 million, about 2.1 million metric tons. And I think the significance of that corn number is that on a weekly basis, that would be about the fifth highest on a weekly basis going back about 20 years. So it was really good. And I get a lot of questions about, why are we seeing these purchases now? And if you really think about it, what it's doing is that right now, the buyers look at it and they see the cash price where it's at that they're buying, but that's really made up of a futures price and a basis. And what that's telling us is that they do really like the basis at these levels, because many times when these contracts are done, they are done just as a basis contract. Now, from the future side, if they thought it was a low futures price and time to come in, they could take that type of position on the board anytime they wanted. So it's really telling us that ultimately our basis, in comparison to what they think it's going to be in other countries, we're very competitive right now. So that's great to see.
And Shawn, I love the fact that it's not just China popping up. We saw Japan this week. We saw Mexico. Obviously, it is a continued buyer. So it's nice to see that diversity in the purchases.
Absolutely. You always hate to be tied to only one country at the whim of them buying or not buying, and to have a more broader distribution, is obviously very, very good to see. And it just says that given the shortages and the smaller crops we've seen in foreign countries and the U.S. good crop, that, we are finally in the position to move grain, to be the buyer of choice, the seller of choice. And I really don't see that changing anytime soon, especially with all the uncertainties going forward with wars potentially, and with the elections coming up and Trump potentially getting in, and all those things that could come with disruptions. If I were a buyer looking at cheap U.S. grain, I'd certainly want to get a fair bit on the books, not knowing how all this is going to play out. And maybe some of that is what's going on here.
We'll talk more about politics here in just a moment. But Jeff, how is it possible? We see that unknown all the time popping up, and everybody speculates who that unknown is. But how does that all come about, and why is it listed the way it is?
That's a great question, and that's one we do often get. And anytime we hear about the unknown showing up in a soybean, purchase, immediately everybody assumes China. Now, over on the corn side, it's not quite as obvious, but we look at our big buyers. Mexico's continuing to be named, and ultimately on the corn side, could it be China? I can't rule it out. We can't confirm that. But let's dig deeper into your question. Really, the one you asked me is, how is that even possible? So, as all part of the export sales system that really, believe it or not, really got started back in the 70s, always because of all the grain that at that time Russia was buying from the U.S. And when that was happening, the government said, hey, there's these individual grain companies that have an advantage. They know what's going on. We need to bring some transparency to all that. So that's why we end up getting the export sales system we do today. But how is it possible that unknown shows up? So let's look at an example here. Let's say I'm a buyer and I want to buy something from a U.S. seller. I could buy those bushels, and really, I may not know where they're going. I may really like the basis level. And so I buy those, and I buy them picked up, or FOB is what we call it, say New Orleans. And at some later point, when I do know where I'm going to send those bushels, I may have an inkling where they're going to go, but I may not have a formal contract yet. Then at that point, when I do formalize something, then I'd have to report back the change, and it'd switch from unknown to whoever it's going to. So that's really the easiest way to explain how that can happen, Susan.
That makes sense, and I'm not the only one that sometimes wondered about that, so thank you for that explanation. You had talked to Shawn just a moment ago a little bit about China, and the nature of what's going on with them. I know there's going to be a big meeting coming up. I think it starts right around, November 4th through the 7th, if I remember those dates correct, and there might be more stimulus talk being brought in.
The Chinese economic model has been always capital leading their economy, not the consumer leading their economy. And of course, now that their real estate market has collapsed, they've lost the engine for growth. And so I think what they're starting to suggest to the market that they want to do is they want to start printing money and fiscally spending money and putting it in the hands of Chinese consumers. And they want to start goosing their stock market and creating the wealth effect, something that the Western countries like the United States have done for a very long time to get the animal spirits of consumerism going in China, because I think they know that the real estate capital intensive led economic growth for the last 20 years is over, and they need to switch gears. There's been a lot of uncertainty of what they originally said versus what they're going to do. That makes this meeting very important. But I do believe they've changed gears. I do believe they're going to be much more active and proactive in supporting consumer demand in China. To the extent that they're successful at that, it could finally be a tailwind for commodities overall and for agriculture commodities to see better demand coming from China. So definitely an important metric to watch for 2025.
Do you have any concerns, Jeff, or maybe are we too early with concerns going into 2025 with how dry it's been here in the Midwest, and not only just in the Western Corn Belt, but concerns in the East as well?
Yeah, that's been really interesting to watch. You think about how quickly that's really fired up and got to this extent. If you were to look back at, just take, for instance, a drought monitor towards, first part of August, we just saw some areas of drought, a few areas popping up here and there in the Western Corn Belt. We'd had some stuff showing up out there in parts of Indiana and Ohio. But then as we continued to stay so dry and so warm all the way through this fall, then we ended up seeing that spread out. And as a matter of fact, I think the latest numbers that I've seen on the drought monitor side would suggest about 76% of the U.S. corn producing areas are in some stage of the drought. And over on the bean side, I think it was like 58%. But to dig in that deeper, yeah, I do think it is a little early. We know that we can pick up some rains here in the fall. I think it's given us a little bit of support, but it does keep everybody a little bit on edge. What it probably keeps everybody from doing, they may not necessarily be buying it because of that, but it keeps maybe a few sellers away a little bit, because they know at some point in time in here that if we don't receive those rains as we get in the first part of the year, it can be a big issue. Right along with that, and I'll kind of add this right with the South American situation, we're going to have to keep an eye down there. Right now, everything looks good. They're getting their rainfall, planning's going along. But as we go further along, as you have even a weak La Nina setup, 3-4 weeks down the road, we're going to have to check in and see, okay, now how's the southern part of Brazil doing? And then what are we seeing on down in Argentina? And I know this week the Rosario Grain Exchange did report that they felt a lot better about the moisture condition and the outlook that they were having in Argentina, but they're not definitely out of the woods yet. That could still pop up down the road soon.
Well, I know never want to talk politics, especially when we're a week and a few days away from a election. But whether you like it or not, it is definitely having an influence, and just, if nothing else, water cooler chatter amongst agriculture. So, Shawn, farm bill, tariffs, politics with this election, there's a lot that's going to weigh in on these markets in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, I mean, right now, certainly, it seems that all the betting markets are suggesting that Trump is starting to potentially get a small lead. Of course, that's subject to change, and there's been a lot of participants putting on Trump trades, as they've been calling it, which would be bearish commodities, bearish grains, you know, bearish bonds and higher interest rates, you know, things of that nature. And so I just think that, you know, we're going to see a lot of capital flows coming in and coming out based upon every day what these betting models are saying, what the candidates are saying, and what the reactions are to that. So it's just going to be a very choppy trade for the next few weeks. And I think we have to keep a longer term perspective, like Jeff said. I think beyond all of that, Mother Nature is still going to be the driver, especially in Brazil and northern Brazil, where the dryness is still intact, has not been improving too much. Russia, Ukraine off to the driest start to their planting season since 2010 and 11. And there's been a high correlation between drought in northern Brazil, drought in Russia, Ukraine, and the following growing season in the United States also being in a drier pattern. So this linkage that we've seen over the last 50 years between these three regions is something to pay attention to that will override and transcend politics in the end, although in the short run, it makes a great deal of difference to short-term trading and short-term hedging opportunities.
All right, as we wrap up, gentlemen, I want to give you 30 seconds and a bullet point. Jeff, what's the one thing you want to look for going into this next week and the last of October?
Yeah, exactly. It's hard to believe that we're there. I mean, the big thing we're looking for is just continuing to see, does our export sales demand hang in there? What do we see as we come in on those final yields? We do think we can see the yields pull back a little bit. And then our next step probably is, you know, we're looking for some additional points to sell here, but we want to see the market bounce just a little bit, but we are going to continue to watch the strengthening basis that's happening.
And for you, Shawn?
I think the two things to really monitor is northern Brazil. Is the dry weather going to really come back strongly, which we believe that it will, and watch China's monetary and fiscal policy decisions. Are they really serious? If they are, I think we're going to see some capital flowing into commodities and into grains.
All right. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this week. A quick reminder to all our listeners and viewers, these commodity futures and options do involve a substantial risk of loss, not suitable to all investors. And that's been another edition of the Nebraska Soybean Board Weekly Market Roundup.